So the slides have not only my name, but Erin Andrews, who is my co-director of the Effective Philanthropy Lab at Stanford PACS, which is on the third floor of the library building. And this is something which we have done for philanthropists and nonprofit leaders, and it's kind of exciting to do it here at Stanford. We're going to be looking at what I think are the four elements of what you could call an outcomes framework. One is to have goals that are clearly defined. Another is that the strategies to achieve those goals are based on good evidence. The picture here is the Poverty Action Lab, JPAL, which develops evidence on interventions in developing countries. Third, it's important to monitor progress as you proceed in order not to drift too far off course. And finally, we're going to look back and say, did you actually succeed in achieving your goals? So that's what we're going to be doing this afternoon. And the claim I want to make, and we can come back to it at the end, is that this kind of program strategy and evaluation is relevant to virtually any social or environmental program or policy you'll develop. To a workforce development program, recycling, to the argument of whether gun control saves lives or whether not having background checks doesn't make any difference, congestion pricing, trying to reduce smoking. This is about a year ago, half a year ago, we were in India, and we used, instead of the example we're using today, we used the example of open defecation, which is a major issue in parts of Delhi and other cities. So the claim is this is useful for everything. I know that for the one policy lab that I'm involved in this quarter, involving climate change, that this basic strategy is going to be critical for anything we do. My guess is it's true for many of the others. So we're going to do this in a dialectic form. I'm going to choose as my problem homelessness in the Bay Area, and you are going to work on another problem in the Bay Area, which is diabetes. And so how do you define the problem? The very first step in solving the problem is to define it. And here we have a story of Peggy and Fred. They just sold their tech startup, and they're concerned with homelessness in their city of San Jose. And they begin by being agnostic about what form an organization might take. Maybe it's going to be a for-profit social enterprise, which will earn revenues. Maybe it'll be a nonprofit organization. Maybe they're going to do advocacy for some policy. Their view is, and this is a very good place to begin with problem solving, whatever is most effective. So the first step is to define the problem. What's the problem they're trying to solve? What are the causes of the problem? Who are their intended beneficiaries? What are their needs? Something really important, which a lot of new philanthropists forget about. They come on the scene and think they're the only people who have ever tried to solve this problem before. It's really important to see who else is doing it. Maybe you can collaborate with them. Maybe you can just give them your money. How big a problem, part of the problem, do you want to tackle? And finally, in this phase, what is the intended outcome? What is the clear goal that you're trying to achieve? It'd be nice if it were as clear as the soccer goal in that picture. So, Einstein famously said, if I had 60, he famously said, or just like Yogi Berra, he had famously attributed to him the quote, if I had 60 minutes to solve a problem, my life depended on it, I'd spend 55 minutes determining the right question to ask. You wish you had Einstein in the room to help you. Instead, you just have me, and you might have had Erin, except she's doing other things today. So here is Fred, and Fred's view of the problem can be symbolized by when he walks to work, he sees a homeless mother and her children, and his heart goes out to them. Peggy on her way to the office, has to work her way through this homeless encampment, which really annoys her a great deal. And their views of the problem are somewhat different. Why don't you be Fred, and I will engage in this dialogue with you. Why is homelessness a problem?
Homelessness is caused by huge inequalities of wealth.
Later, it may be important to understand the causes, but right now, tell me why homelessness is a problem.
Homeless families need shelter.
That sounds more like a particular solution. We'll come to solutions later. But first, why is homelessness a problem? In other words, why does it concern you as a philanthropist or a nonprofit leader?
Well, because no one should have to live in the streets.
Why is living on the street a problem?
People are exposed to elements, cold, rain, snow, heat.
And why is that a problem?
Because being homeless deprives people of dignity, privacy, and personal security.
Right, so, we're digging down, and, the answers may get more and more obvious as you get further along. My own view is the place to stop is when Fred gets so annoyed that he hits me over the head. At that point, we can stop. Peggy, would you be Peggy? Peggy, what's the problem of homelessness in your city?
It's caused by lax enforcement of public health and safety regulations.
Later, it may be important to understand the causes, but first tell me, why is homelessness a problem?
We need to move homeless people out of town.
That sounds more like a particular solution. We'll come to solutions later, but first, why is homelessness a problem? In other words, why does it concern you as a philanthropist?
Homeless people congregate in some residential and business neighborhoods.
And why is that a problem?
You should see the homeless encampment blocking the sidewalks just down the street from my house.
And why is that a problem?
They disturb and frighten people and make it uncomfortable for residents and business patrons to walk on the streets. They reduce residents' quality of life, lower property values, and reduce merchants' revenues. The homeless people abuse drugs, and some engage in criminal behavior. Also, many of these people have diseases which they may pass on to each other.
That sounds like you're making some big factual assumptions. How certain are you that they actually cause these problems?
Well, that's what I've heard.
All right. Well, thank you, Fred and Peggy. So what's the next step? The next step before you go any further is to do some research. And fundamentally, there are kind of two different kinds of research that Fred and Peggy might do, directly or through people who they trust who are good at this. One is kind of academic research. There's a huge amount online about the causes of homelessness and possible solutions. But the other thing is get out on the street and listen to beneficiaries and other stakeholders, because you're not going to figure this out sitting in your office, right? So if you are Fred, go yourself, or if you don't think you have the skills or comfort level, have somebody go and talk to homeless people in San Jose. If you're Peggy, go talk to the people who feel annoyed and disadvantaged by homeless people. And by the way, Fred would do well to talk to that group, and Peggy would do well to talk to homeless people at all. So do some research, listen to the beneficiaries as well. And after doing that, they bring it home. And here is Fred's tentative description of the problem. Homelessness deprives individuals and families of dignity, privacy, and personal security. Notice that he doesn't have a cause in the problem, nor does he have a solution. It's why this is a problem, why he believes this is a problem that bothers him. The potential beneficiaries are homeless individuals and their families, and their needs are shelter, health care, jobs, school, stability. For Peggy, the problem is homeless people adversely affect the economy and the quality of life for other individuals in the city. The potential beneficiaries are residents, businesses, and communities adversely affected, and their needs are safety and security and the quality of life, reducing the cost to taxpayers. So now, and this is the first time I'm going to ask you to do some work in your groups of three, what's the problem of diabetes in the Bay Area, or if you want to focus in Silicon Valley? So what's the problem? Who are your intended beneficiaries? I've already told you the geographic locale. Let's make it the South Bay. Why is the problem important to you? And you in whatever role you would have solving it. And just a few don'ts. Don't describe the causes. We're interested in what the problem is. Don't describe the problem in terms of a particular solution, because otherwise you're going to foreclose other solutions and avoid making questionable empirical assumptions. Why don't I give you roughly 3 minutes in groups? By the way, you don't need to take pictures of this because we're going to make the slides available. So why don't you start? And I'll time you. Just notice that just as in the dialogue with Fred and Peggy, it's useful to dig down and to try to understand why it's a problem, which you all did. Okay. Next. Oh, and the point once again is that, even before answering this question, but after you have your tentative answers, once again, we don't have time to do it here, but just as in the case of homelessness, there's an awful lot of research, medical and social science research about the nature of the problem. But you also might want to learn from the beneficiaries, in this case, both people who are pre-diabetic, diabetic, and who are concerned about the social costs as well. But the next question is causation. Right? We purposely didn't ask about causes yet, but it's going to be important. And here's why it's important. In the mid-19th century, there was an outbreak of cholera in London. And people at the time thought that the cause of cholera was the fog that, during these days of the Industrial Revolution, pervaded London. And with that cause came one particular solution, which is sleep and clothe warm and don't sleep in a draft, because it was the cold fog that was going to cause it. The other solution was a solution to everything at the time. Maybe it should be today also. Be temperate in eating and drinking. So along comes John Snow, who is, so far as I know, the first epidemiologist in history. And he does a kind of stakeholder research where he tries to map cases of cholera, and he notices that they are particularly dense near a particular pump that's pumping water out of a particular place in the Thames. And he hypothesizes that cholera is not the result of a fog, but the result of waterborne bacteria. And the solution that he recommends, which was followed with considerable success, is don't take water from that part of the Thames. So disabling the pump made a big difference. So homelessness is a much more complex problem than a bacteria-caused disease. It's not just that there are different causes, but there are different causes for different people. Somebody who comes back from being in Afghanistan or Iraq with PTSD, and many of the problems that come with that, has different costs from somebody who just couldn't afford their housing. Right? That's a very, very different kind of cause, and those different causes may lead to different solutions. So once again, you're dealing with a problem that is both, my guess is, medical and social. And why don't you take 3 minutes again and talk about what do you think are the causes for the population that you're concerned with, and when you report out, talk about what population you're focusing on. Take 3 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes again. Okay, terrific. So we now have a bunch of hypotheses about causes, and they may interact in different ways. So now let's begin actually solving the problem. I think you can put the different approaches to solving a social and environmental problem in 4 different buckets. You can just think of the buckets as a way of helping you think about different kinds of solutions. One is service delivery, right? In the case of homeless, well, I'll come back to homeless, but one is service delivery, providing services to a client. Another is changing people's behavior. In the context of smoking, you have both the possibility of taxing, which will reduce consumption of cigarettes, or if you see in vaping right now, just forbidding it, but also providing information using psychological techniques. Another is research, because sometimes we need to know more about the causes of the problem. And the last one I have is advocacy for policy change or systems change. So in the context of homelessness, here are 3 different approaches that might be based on service delivery and behavior change. Provide assistance to homeless people on the streets, provide stable housing for them, or look, this is something that King County, Greater Seattle, is focusing on. Identify families at risk of being evicted and work to prevent them from being evicted. Research, given the very different populations that may be homeless, learn more about the causes and maybe the solutions to their problems. And then policy advocacy. If you think about homelessness in this area, it could be that zoning, which restricts new housing being built, the economy in general is having an effect on this, and you may want to do things that get at that through economic changes. Here are what I think are some of the basic criteria for how you choose what approach to take. One is, how well does it fit your own needs? I mean, ultimately it should fit the client's needs, but your own interests play a role, especially your risk tolerance, because we'll see that some strategies are more risky than others. For example, in the case, just to go back here, providing service delivery is really pretty unrisky. That is, once you know that a strategy works, you can probably roll it out pretty safely, whereas advocacy is always highly risky. The chances that you're going to succeed in getting the Board of Supervisors of Santa Clara County or the City Council of San Jose to adopt zoning changes is considerably less than 100%. So risk tolerance, how likely is it that it will meet the beneficiary's needs? Do you have the resources to do it, either acting alone or aggregating the resources with others? And then I think kind of most fundamentally is a question of cost and benefit. Are the benefits of the strategy worth the cost that it takes to do it? And when you're involved in a risky strategy, you need to discount the benefits by the likelihood of succeeding. Right? In an area that the climate practicum is going to explore, many strategies for reducing climate change have far less than 100% chance of success. What justifies strategies with low probabilities of success is the huge benefits if it actually makes a difference for climate. So the approach that I've taken for dealing with homelessness is providing stable housing. This is actually a picture of a new housing unit in San Jose for formerly homeless people. And what I would like you to do now in your groups again is spend 4 minutes brainstorming, what strategies might you use? And you don't need to fit them in one of these categories, but these categories are designed to be suggestive of different approaches you might take. So 4 minutes, back to you. Okay, that's a good group of approaches. Now we're going to do what I think is the second hardest part of developing a strategy. No, actually, we're not quite there. Maybe this is the third hardest part, which is each group take one approach that you develop and think about what a successful outcome would be, what it would mean to achieve success. So in the case of stable housing, our notion of success is people who are chronically homeless. And these are mostly people, the group we're dealing with are ones who have mental and physical illnesses, drug addictions, that they'll be in stable residence in this place for at least a year. So now take some time in your groups again, just a couple more minutes. What would success would like? Look for a single first of all, a single strategy and a single outcome. Don't worry so much about how you're going to measure it, but it should be measurable enough that a year from now or 2 years from now, after you've adopted the program, you would know whether you have made a significant difference. One outcome. And I should say, after this, just so you might want to choose an outcome with this in mind, I said this is the third hardest thing. We're then going to do the second hardest, which is developing a strategy to achieve your particular outcome. Okay, a couple of minutes for a discernible outcome. This brings us to the second hardest thing, and then we'll do this and then let you take a bit of a break, which is developing a theory of change. And a theory of change is nothing but a pathway to achieve your ultimate outcome. So in the case of homelessness, in the case of permanent supportive housing, which is my strategy, the ultimate outcome is that previously homeless people become stable residents. And then the question is, how are we going to achieve that? There are basically two activities that our housing organization or the city of San Jose is going to adopt. One is they're going to provide housing, make it available free for previously homeless people. But the other is they're going to provide what are called wraparound services to deal with physical and mental illness and drug addiction. That's what we do. This is where we hope we go. But now the question is, how do we get from what we do to where we want to go? And the answer is, it requires behavior change on the part of the residents who come into the permanent supportive housing. They first of all need to come. If they don't come, it's not going to work. And they need to avail themselves of support services that are necessary. So a critical distinction is between activities and outcomes. An activity is what you do. An outcome is what happens as a result of what you do. Many of you have probably seen Field of Dreams, right? You build the baseball field, that's the activity. Their coming is the outcome you want. Or in my case, you provide the housing and support services, and their coming and living stable is, well, finally, just one. It's a distinction worth emphasizing. You all know the cliche, you can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink. Leading the horse to water is your activity. Drinking is actually an outcome. It's actually what I would call an intermediate outcome, because what's the ultimate outcome of the horse drinking? Yeah, it becomes hydrated, right? So it's really activities leading it. Drinking is an intermediate outcome. Being hydrated for its own health, as you can go on with the trip, is the ultimate outcome. For almost all the strategies you're going to be concerned with, that you've come up with, the intermediate outcome requires behavior change on the part of beneficiaries or somebody else. The most common error in theories of change, you can just read it. If you think that whatever science these people are doing is hard, social change of the sort that you're working on is much, much harder, and you can't rely on a miracle. I'm going to skip, well, let me just tell you, I don't want you to use policy advocacy as an example because it's too complicated for various reasons when you develop your own theory of change. But let me tell you something interesting when you're advocating for a policy. There are actually two different theories of change involved. One is, what's the theory of change underlying the policy you're advocating for? That is, suppose you're trying to get Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors to subsidize permanent supportive housing. Is it going to work? Is it going to create stable residency? And then there's the theory of change underlying advocacy itself. That is, how do you advocate? The ultimate outcome of advocacy is that Santa Clara County does fund the permanent supportive housing. How do you do that? Well, the activities are those that all lobbyists use, whether for-profit or nonprofit. You meet with people who are going to influence the decision. You provide them credible information, ideally. And the intermediate outcome is they're persuaded about the benefits of permanent supportive housing. So you really actually need, but if you're not, if the strategy, if the policy you're advocating for doesn't have a strong theory of change, then you may succeed in getting it adopted, but it's not going to go anywhere. Did I see a hand before? All right. So what I'm going to ask you to do, and we're going to hand out for each group a sheet, and we'll give you 10 minutes for this, which is not nearly enough time to do a very good theory of change. You do your best, is take your ultimate outcome and develop what activities, first of all, plug in the outcome, because you always, for quite appropriate, just as we're hitting the Jewish New Year, you read a theory of change or develop one as in Hebrew or Arabic. You start on the right side. Put your outcome there. And then what activities are you going to do to achieve what intermediate outcomes to achieve the ultimate outcome? And let me suggest that also, as I say, many of the intermediate outcomes require behavior change. And let me suggest that some of you, when in the previous discussion, suggested outcomes that really were intermediate. They weren't the ultimate thing you're looking for success. So just think about that as you sketch in. And why don't you take 7 minutes for this? Okay, recognizing that this is a very short amount of time even to sketch something, would some group be willing to come put their theory of change on the document camera and share out and get feedback? So talk the group through.
Okay.
Always begin by reminding people what the ultimate outcome is.
Okay, our ultimate outcome is to decrease the prevalence of diabetes in people from 20 years to 50 years, like young adults. And because we thought, with the help of the professor, that it would be easier to measure that, I scratched, that was decrease the consumption of foods with high percentage of foods and increase quality of life that we neither can measure that. So bearing that in mind, our major intermediate outcomes is...
How about beginning by what are you going to do to get to your intermediate outcomes?
Okay, to get to our intermediate outcome, we will make better labeling in foods and increase taxes in sugar foods.
Okay. These are two different strategies, just to notice. And each one has its own theory of change, right? They're both designed to change people's behavior, but through really quite different means. And now talk about the intermediate outcomes.
intermediate outcomes would be make sugary food less attractive and decrease the consumption of food with high percentage of sugar.
So what do you think leads to decreasing the consumption?
To decreasing the consumption?
Why is that going to happen?
Because that's going to happen, for example, because people is better informed because we have better labels.
If that's going to, if informing people is a means that should be an intermediate outcome too, right? That is better labeling leads to better information. That's an intermediate outcome. People are informed. And then what do they need to do in order to decrease the consumption of bad food? I have information all the time about what I should do to behave myself for better health. I don't always do it. So they need somehow to be motivated to do it, don't they?
Yeah, have internal motivation. We thought that by increasing, for example, the cost of this food, that would lead to an internal motivation to not spend money on that.
Right, so that's what the tax does. Right, so there really are, and this is very helpful theory of change, there really are two different theories of change, and I would identify them separately. One is a theory of change based on the economic theory that the more something costs, the less the demand there is for it, right? So I don't need to have any, stay there. It's your theory of change that I'm describing. So it costs more, you're going to eat less. And the psychology there is pretty standard. But the other is more complicated, right? It's that labeling is going to lead to decreased food. And that's a more complicated theory of change, right? Because, the person has to read the label. That's an intermediate outcome. The person has to understand what it is they're reading. And now the person has to act on that. So those are all really intermediate outcomes, one leading to the other, leading to the ultimate outcome of decrease in the food and ultimately decrease in diabetes.
We thought that the idea that is in both activities is the same in the way that you are making food less attractive.
But you're right, the general idea is the same, but there really are two different ways of making it less attractive, right?
Yeah.
One is to make it more expensive, and the other is, in effect, to persuade people that it's in their best interest. So each one of those is a different pathway. Any questions for this group? Let's take one more. This is very good. Thank you.
So we talked about the mutual aid-based community organizing model, and we actually found a group online through a Google search that does this. And so one strategy would just be to reach out to them and fund them and see what they're doing, or ask to share their models.
Invent your own theory for them. Tell us what your theory.
We also tried to do that.
That's what's important. What's important, finding a group is easy. Developing a theory of change is hard.
Yeah, so I guess we started with the activity which would be fund and support.
Now talk about the ultimate outcome first. This is
ultimate outcome
the
is
Hebrew theory of change.
So we tried to keep it manageable in terms of that the group would self-articulate goals and show that they met them. How we would initially understand those goals would be that a group leads to a sense of community, reduced stigma, and political and individual analysis and action. And that could be action to change behavior, if that's what folks want to do. That could be action that is advocacy in nature. It could be action that relates to outreach. And so leaving that very open for now, but just as long as the ultimate outcome is that there's something that people identify as being supported by this group.
Who wants to play my role and ask the tough question about this? before we go any further? I'll ask it. Suppose that you reduce stigma, and suppose that you have this political and individual analysis and action, but it doesn't lead to any change in diabetes rates. Have you succeeded? No.
Yeah.
Really? I thought your goal was to reduce diabetes originally, so you've given up on that goal?
I don't know. I mean, I think that, again, we only had 7 minutes, but my initial reaction would be that for me, that's still a win. And that I'm also coming, like, I have some understanding of, like, harm reduction among people who are drug users and people who use drugs. And I'm wondering if there's, like, a similar approach to harm reduction within this, like, mutual aid and harm reduction.
So why is it a win if you're not succeeding in reducing harm?
Well, what do you mean by harm?
I thought our goal was to reduce diabetes.
Reduce diabetes rates or
Reduce diabetes in some way.
Well, the issue that we have
address diabetes.
address diabetes, not reduce thank you. I'm not like trying to argue because I like think that I'm right or like know everything. I'm just like my instinct is that it's a win, and yeah, it's probably not really well articulated.
No, I think it's very well articulated. I would put it in the intermediate outcome category.
I don't think I would.
So
I think addressing diabetes, and if we're talking about the problem being partly quality of life, right? We talked about like, no, it's not up there. But we talked about the problem partly being quality of life, and so with reduced stigma, like reduced anxiety, like those mental health outcomes improve quality of life. Like we know that, we see that.
Okay, if the goal is to improve the quality of life independent of diabetes, there still is the question of whether this succeeds.
It might
Right.
address diabetes without reducing diabetes rates.
Would your ultimate goal be to address rather than reduce?
That's what it says.
Yeah. So look, I'm picking on not you, but on this theory of change because I think it's really critical to be clear about the goal. And if the goal is the community, then you're absolutely right, you're there. If the goal is I'm not even sure what the goal of addressing diabetes is, as somebody mentioned there, but if the goal is to reduce diabetes, then that's the ultimate outcome. And then this community approach is only as good as succeeds in achieving the goal.
So you would put this here and then like reducing diabetes.
That's right. And one reason I put it there is because there's a big, important empirical question about whether this support community actually succeeds in reducing diabetes. By making it the ultimate outcome, you're making that empirical question vanish. Some support groups may do that, others may not, and there's probably research on what kind of support systems succeed in doing that and what doesn't. But you lose the opportunity to ask that empirical question if you simply say the outcome is having a support group.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm not fully.
I'm not asking you to. You're not on the witness stand. Liz.
I was just going to offer maybe one way of articulating the ultimate goal that could incorporate some of what you're talking about while being kind of more of an actual ultimate goal would be to reduce the harm associated with diabetes. And then I think maybe what you were getting at is that the assumption that reducing the rate of diabetes is the way that we do that is maybe like an extra step. So maybe she's talking about some other harms that are associated with diabetes, but really the question is for people who are suffering from it, what is harming, what's causing the harm for them, and how do they want to change it versus necessarily going straight to that.
So that's very fine. you're asking the questions that I asked of Fred initially, which is, why do you want to do it? And if the reason you want to reduce diabetes is to reduce, say, stigma, then that's the ultimate goal. And then, of course, there'd be lots of different strategies which don't have anything to do with diabetes that might reduce people's stigma. Even if that's the goal, you still have to ask the question of whether a community support group reduces stigma. So you can plug that in as the ultimate outcome. My guess is that if I were going to choose people not going around feeling stigmatized as my ultimate outcome, I'm not sure diabetes plays a major role in being stigmatized. So you might look for all sorts of other strategies. Indeed, some strategies to reduce diabetes, like measuring people's BMI, might increase stigma rather than reduce them.
Right. Just to clarify, my goal that I suggested wasn't to reduce stigma, it was just all harm, so incorporating both.
Okay, if you're going to reduce all harms, then you have to begin thinking of, how would you think about, suppose your goal was to reduce all harms to a particular group in the South Bay.
Oh, I meant all harms associated with diabetes, right? Not so health harms, stigma, everything that is worse for me as a diabetes sufferer because of diabetes. I guess is what holistic.
And suppose you were going to do this. This is very helpful. Suppose you're going to do that, and thank you a lot for being on the spot here. Suppose you were going to do that. How would you think about developing a theory of change for that?
Well, I think similar to. I'm sorry. What was your name?
Thea.
Yeah. I think I would start by trying to figure out what are the harms.
Right. So you start
Right,
by identifying each harm.
Right.
Then what?
Right, and then figuring out what are ways to address each of those harms, or some of them together, and then choose one path to address one of the harms. Right. So one way to go about it is to talk about to think about how to change the prevalence of diabetes, or how to change the intensity of the suffering from the medical part of diabetes. Those are all strands, but I think what Thea maybe was getting at is that from this point, sitting in this classroom, we wouldn't want to decide that the medical aspect is the root without having talked to stakeholders.
Absolutely right. So I think your approach to designing the theory of change is the one that I would take if I. So you would identify the separate harms, and then you would ask, in effect, what can we do? What can our organization do to take one at a time? You may have to aggregate it. Take one at a time. What can we do? How strong an influence might we have? And you're right, it needn't be all medical. And then you might have to develop a separate theory of change for each one of those. But what's critical is that you see the question involving the causal link between your activities and the intermediate outcomes, and the intermediate outcomes and where you go. So if a support group, and I'm not at all against support groups, if a support group can reduce something you've identified as a major harm, that's fine. But whether a support group can do that is an empirical question. And what you want in a theory of change, in effect, to lay bare all the empirical questions so it pushes you to answer them rather than assume the answer. So thank you, Thea. Thank you, Liz. I think this has been very helpful. Let me see if other people have questions based on the last 10 minutes of dialogue.
We could, still sticking with the idea of a support group, let's say this group is formed by self-identified people as having diabetes, and assuming that it has something to do with their life habits and the way their food habits, maybe people that are living around them also have the same probability to become to develop diabetes. Because I mean, if you're thinking about a household mom, she's the food she's eating is the food that her child are also eating. So if you would, in these groups, provide information about how to change food habits, and maybe sharing some recipes of healthier food, but really tasty food for the kids, and then
so that the activity is providing that information.
yeah, provide information. So
Right.
so let's bring healthy recipes to this group of moms that have diabetes, so they can start back at their homes, providing better meals to their families.
Great. So that's
So in a long run-
one intermediate outcome. Let's try this. So the activity is information about healthy foods.
Healthy foods, yeah.
What's the ultimate outcome?
The ultimate outcome is preventing diabetes, preventing people to develop diabetes.
Okay. Now let's talk about the intermediate
The
outcome.
intermediate outcome would be having these families that are involved to improve their diets in terms of getting more healthy food at their homes.
Right. What's called better.
Cooking more healthy foods at their home, less sugar, less fat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does anything need to happen between here and here?
The group will have to meet periodically,
Right.
and in a way that was appealing to parents to go and to attend and to have fun with it,
So let's
and get engaged with the recipe, healthy recipes ideas.
parents attend. And what next? After they attend,
They have to go home. They have to cook.
before
healthy meals for their
they
kids.
have to go home. That's right. What happens in between attending and going home and cooking?
They have to go to the grocery store and buy.
What happens at the meeting,
The meetings.
or as a result of the meeting?
The result of the meeting is that everyone learned the recipe and get enthusiastic to go home
Right.
and to cook to their kids.
Right. They learn and they're enthusiastic.
Yeah.
My guess is that all of us have the experience of attending things where we didn't learn anything, of learning things, but the enthusiasm, not being enthusiastic, of being enthusiastic while you're in the meeting, and then the minute you leave, it disappears. So this is a behavior change. As I said, almost all social theories of change require behavior change, and there are a lot of behaviors here. And it's not a matter of faith, but a matter of empiricism, whether you can get all of these things to happen. My guess is that some organizations have strategies that work for these and that some don't. And that's really my only point, that what you want is the theory of change to lay out all the causal links that have to happen, and then you can ask one link after another, how likely is it to happen? How can we increase the likelihood of it happening? You want to say something else?
No, just thinking that maybe you could have people who are attending the meetings to cook their meals there, like a workshop. So they would leave the meeting already with the meal cooked and ready to send to their families when they got home, and then that way they were asked if their kids like the food, so they would get involved with the thing as well. So the behavior would be concentrated in attending the meeting.
So any other thoughts about, I think this is a very helpful addition to the dialogue we started with. Any other thoughts about where we've just been? So something which we're not going to take the time to do, just because we're getting close to being out of time, but having developed a theory of change, the next step is to ask what can go wrong. Right? The idea of a pre-mortem, which is not my idea, it comes from a very interesting social scientist, is you assume that it's failed. Because that then clears your mind of having to ask, is it going to succeed? Is it going to fail? You assume this is going to fail and then look for all the failure points. So to look at, in effect, Guillermo just identified both the theory of change, and each one of these is a failure point. If the parents don't attend, it's not going to work. If the parents attend, but suppose that this is a non-English speaking group and the talks are all in English and they don't understand it, it's not going to work. If they understand it, but don't leave enthusiastic about doing something about it, it's not going to work. So you look for all the failure points. And the reason you look for the failure points is then to see, can you remedy these? Something we're not going to get into, unfortunately, because maybe we will. So I'm not going to. So look, we have 15 minutes left. I was going to give you a break, but I'd actually rather, I'll bring the cookies in, speaking of diabetes, and not take a break. Put these in people can pass them around. Anyway, we're not going to take the time for it, but this is really important. And having a theory of change of the sort we've just been discussing for the last half hour is going to help you do this. It's going to see where things might break down. Okay, so without a break, I want to talk about implementing the strategy. Right, so we've designed the strategy, and let's take the support group strategy, and it's now time to implement it. There are three kinds of ways of looking at how it's going. One critically important one is just to get unstructured feedback. So I'm going to use the support group example and with parents coming to it. So you ask the people in the group, how are you doing? How's it doing? Are you liking what you're learning? Are you learning anything? Without a particular protocol, without even focusing on your own theory of change, you can learn an awful lot. Just as when we designed the strategy, you need to go into the field, you can learn an awful lot by asking people, how's it going? Here's an example, speaking of language problems. Second Harvest Food Bank, which has 10, I think, different locations in the Bay Area, Santa Clara and San Mateo County, they actually did some structured feedback. They used something that's used in business a fair amount, Net Promoter Scores, which is essentially, would you recommend this to a friend? And they noticed that of their 10 sites, 3 of them had noticeably lower scores than the others. And that led them to find out why. The reason, it turns out, is these were 3 areas in which the recipients of the food bank were mainly Vietnamese, and there were kind of a mixture of language, communication issues, and cultural issues that made it unattractive for the Vietnamese recipient. So one form of feedback, you just call it feedback. It can be more or less structured. Yes?
Do you find it as getting your clients' feedback? Are you using client interchangeably with beneficiaries?
Yeah, I meant to say beneficiaries. I think the food bank thinks of it as their clients, but right. So you can you can think of, in general, everybody who is affected by your program as a stakeholder, and within that, I think of beneficiaries as a particularly important group of stakeholders. Those are the people you are designing the program mainly to succeed. All right. Then we come to what people call monitoring. And monitoring is basically looking at your theory of change and asking, how are we doing along the path of activities to intermediate outcomes to ultimate outcome? Every one of you have been involved in some sort of a fundraising campaign, and this is a very common monitoring target. It actually has 2 features. One, it has a goal. What are you trying to get in? This is actually my colleague Erin's school, where they have a fundraising campaign. I don't know what 100% is like, but you always want to get 100%. And then, how are you doing along the way? So you have metrics, which in this case is how much money you're raising, and targets, which is how much you want to raise. So in my homelessness strategy, think about, let's just this time read from left to right. The activities you're engaging in is kind of building the housing and recruiting homeless people and recruiting staff. So we know how to measure that, right? It's how many units of housing you're making available, how many staff, how many homeless people are you recruiting, how many staff. And then you have intermediate outcomes. That is, they will come and stay there, and they receive necessary assistance. And then the ultimate outcome is, do people become stable residents for at least a year, which is our metric and target. And just as in a fundraising campaign, the targets need to be realistic, but they can be ambitious. I think it's pretty realistic to say that if you have 150 people move in, that's what the new San Jose complex have, that if 85 of them are in stable residence, given the nature of this population, that's pretty good. The reason for having metrics is pretty obvious, right? If you're not achieving the activities, if you're not doing the activities, you're not going to achieve the intermediate outcomes. If you're not achieving the intermediate outcomes, you're not going to get to the ultimate outcome. And the reason for targets is, if you fall below the target, it's an opportunity to say, what can we do better? If you do better, so much the better. So I want to end, and this really should be a class all in itself, given how complicated just developing the theory of change is, as we've seen in the last hour and 3/4. I want to end by reiterating something that I think Rob touched on this morning, which is the difference between achieving your outcome and achieving impact. So assume that the outcome occurred. Assume, in my case, that we have people in stable residence, or in your case, that whatever strategy you used, the target audience has reduced diabetes than it did, then you achieve the outcome of reduced diabetes. The question is, did your program cause that reduction in diabetes, or might it have happened anyway? And the might it have happened anyway is what is called the counterfactual. It would have happened even without your program. This, I think, this cartoon kind of gives you the concept of impact very clearly, right? These wolves are howling at the moon to make it go away, and one wolf turns to the other is, are we making an impact? The counterfactual, of course, is the moon would have gone away even if they hadn't howled at the moon. So my wife and I support an organization called Classics for Kids that gives reasonably good stringed instruments to kids in poor communities. How do you evaluate whether you had impact? Well, you have to begin, as we did in the first part of this class, with what is your outcome? What outcome are you trying to achieve? In the same way, is the outcome a health outcome for diabetes? Is the outcome a other well-being indicator? So there are three possible goals for Classics for Kids. One is just participating in the orchestra is a good thing in itself. It's as if going to a support group is a good thing in itself. Another is that they will learn to appreciate music, and this will just be a good thing now and in their future life. The director of the program, although I must say not my wife and me, believes that it improves academic performance. So the goal for him, not the only goal, but a goal is kids do well. And they do, it turns out that the kids who are in orchestras that get these free stringed instruments do pretty well. But that raises a fundamental question of impact, which is, do they do well because they play in the orchestra? Or is it possible that the kids who are doing well are the ones who play in the orchestra, the ones who are doing well already? The counterfactual is they would have done just as well if they hadn't played in the orchestra. And they're essentially, and in our permanent supportive housing example, we have the permanent supportive housing program with wraparound services. people who were formerly homeless are now in stable residency. But suppose we wanted to know whether the wraparound services actually made a difference, because these wraparound physical and mental health services are very expensive. So if they don't make a difference, then we don't need to have them. How do we test that? And there are fundamentally three ways of testing it, which I'm going to talk about in the last 7 minutes, which is before and after, matching, and randomization. So before and after is, suppose that in 2014, for this housing program, we didn't have supporting services. We didn't have wraparound services. And now we have them, and people are doing better. People are more stable. The big question is, did the wraparound services make a difference? So here's a quick story, which I think especially lawyers in this room, law students, will appreciate. Bill Bratton, who was the police commissioner hired by then Mayor Giuliani, came to New York and implemented what's called the broken windows theory of policing, that if you go after minor offenses, jumping the turnstiles, vandalism, and the like, that will have an effect on major offenses, homicide, and robbery rates. And he becomes police chief in 1995, and look at the significant decline of robbery and homicide rates. Well, there are a number of things you want to ask about before and after, but one is you want to kind of look a little bit before the before. And it turns out that robbery and homicide rates had already begun falling before he became police commissioner. So before and after, for all of its other benefits and limitations, is you want to take a broad look. So the other thing is you want to ask what else might have happened during this period to account for this, to account for the decrease in robbery and homicide rates during this period. What might have happened in San Jose during the period between when we didn't have wraparound services and did, to account for the outcome. One theory about policing in New York is that the crack epidemic had peaked. And of course, the use of crack cocaine leads to both robberies and homicides. What might have happened in San Jose? The economy might have changed during this period. It might be that people who were formerly out of work and therefore homeless now had a job. We just need to look for that. But when you do before-after comparisons, you always want to look for exogenous variables that might have affected. Matching. Suppose you could look for something else. One thing you might want to do is compare New York to other cities at the time. Did the homicide rate in New York go down when it wasn't changing or going up in other cities? So suppose, this is hypothetical, suppose at the same time it went down in New York, it went up in Detroit. One thing you would ask is, well, are there other differences between New York and Detroit besides Bratton's use of the broken windows approach that might have made a difference? One difference, which I'm the only person who's ever thought of, I think, is New York is protected by Batman, and Detroit isn't. So that's the other, and it turns out actually when you look at other cities that homicide and robbery rates went down in major urban areas throughout the United States. So once again, the problem with matching is nicely captured by this little cartoon, which used to be on milk cartons when I was growing up. Can you spot the differences? And if you're going to match New York with other cities, the question is, are there significant differences between New York and the other cities besides the broken windows theory of policing that might have accounted for the decline in the crime rate? There are apparently 12 differences between these two pictures. It's pretty hard to spot. But a good empirical economist using matching is going to look for all the possible differences and try then to assess whether those differences might have accounted for the difference in crime rates rather than the hypothesis that it was the broken windows theory. And then finally, if you can do it, if you can do a randomized controlled trial, it's the way you can be most confident that a causal conclusion is actually justified. So imagine that you have two permanent supportive housing units across the street from each other. One has wraparound services and the other doesn't. And the administrator, when somebody comes, when any of us come as a potential client or beneficiary, the administrator flips a coin to decide which one of us gets wraparound services and which doesn't. Whatever difference there might be between stable residency over the period of a year, if it's really people are randomly assigned, then we can be reasonably confident that it was the wraparound services that made a difference. If, as somebody said earlier in another context, if people self-select, or if the administrator gets to select them, then we can be much less confident. So I'm going to end. I'm not going to talk about evaluating advocacy, but I'm going to end with a 30-second commercial for theories of change, which is whatever your goal is, stable residency, or in many of your cases, reducing diabetes or other effects of diabetes, you aspire to hit the bullseye all the time. In all of your practicums where you have policy goals, that's what you do. Even with a very, very well thought out theory of change, you're lucky if you hit the target most of the time and the bullseye once in a while. And without a strategy, you don't have a chance. That's my commercial for theories of change. Thanks for spending 2 hours with me, and thank you also, especially Thea and others who were willing to put themselves on the spot to discuss theories of change. Have a nice afternoon.